Hey guys, tonight we step into the cool, whispering dusk of the Andes Mountains. You're perched on a high ridge, your feet brushing against time-smoothed stone, with nothing around you but wind sky, and an endless line of paving stones stretching toward the horizon. Below, clouds crawl lazily between distant peaks. No cars, no noise, just you, the thin mountain air, and a path that once connected one of the largest empires the world had ever seen without ever using the wheel. The Inca Empire, which rose to power in the 15th century, didn't bother with horses' carts or roads for leisure. Their roads were built for one thing: pure utilitarian speed. At its peak, their empire stretched over 2,500 miles along the spine of South America, from modern-day Colombia to Chile, and you better believe they had to get messages from one end to the other fast. You're about to enter a world where elite runners dashed across mountains, deserts, and jungles to pass along everything from royal orders to fresh fish. Yes, fish. And yes, they were still wiggling when they arrived in the capital. You'll follow one of these runners called chasquis as they sprint across dizzying trails, navigating a network of tambos, rest stops, dodging avalanches, and delivering knotted strings called quipus that may have held the empire's secrets. Historians still argue whether those knots were math memory or a hidden code only a few could read. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shift your pack and begin walking down the trail, sandals crunching softly against the gravel. The stones underfoot are precisely fitted together so tightly you could swear they were laid just yesterday. No mortar, no cement, just skilled hands and a lot of time. These are the Capacñan royal roads, wide enough for a whole platoon of messengers or a royal caravan. And while most of the world thinks the Romans cornered the market on ancient roads, the Incas would like a word. Their highway system spanned mountains and deserts, and was so well made that parts of it are still used today. In some areas, modern highways run next to them because the Inca path was laid out better. No joke. You might expect potholes or collapsed bridges, but many of these ancient paths are still in excellent shape, testament to the road builders who worked with obsidian tools and had no written blueprints, just geometry patience and an absurd number of rocks. You pause at a fork in the trail. One path winds down toward a river. The other climbs sharply toward a peak where the air looks thinner than a supermodel on a juice cleanse. And it's that steeper path the chasqui would take. Of course, because speed is everything, and apparently so is lung capacity. The Inca runners weren't ordinary folks. These were elite athletes trained from childhood. Imagine the Olympic Games, but instead of a stadium and TV cameras, it's a jagged ridge and a condor circling above you like it's already planning your funeral. The messengers would sprint for miles, often with messages so urgent they couldn't afford to stop for more than a few breaths. A chasqui could cover a stretch in minutes, hand off the message at a tambo, and the next runner would take off like a baton just got passed in an empire-wide relay race. And oh, those messages. They weren't letters. Inca didn't have writing, remember? Instead, they used quipus, which are ropes of knotted strings. Depending on how the knots were tied, where they were placed, and what colors were used, the cords could represent numbers, data, and possibly whole stories. One theory is that they worked like mnemonic devices tools to help the chasquis or administrators remember vast amounts of information. Another theory. They were a full-blown written language that we just can't decode anymore. Either way, you're looking at an empire that moved knowledge across thousands of miles using glorified friendship bracelets. You reach your first tambo, nestled between two cliffs. It's low and rectangular, built with the same stonework as the road. Inside, you imagine shelves of supplies, dried cornucopia leaves, spare sandals, maybe even a llama or two hanging out in the corner like slightly disgruntled cats. These roadside inns were spaced out evenly, so a runner was never too far from food, water, or a warm place to crash. Well, warm is relative. This is the Andes after all. But you get the idea. The cool part? These tambos weren't just for chasquis. They were government outposts. Think of them as FedEx hubs, military checkpoints, and Airbnb cabins, all rolled into one. Some were massive complexes with hundreds of rooms. Others were humble little huts with a fire pit and a view of the valley that'd make an Instagram influencer cry as you sip a little imaginary chicha fermented corn beer. Don't worry, it's mild. You can't help but admire the sheer logistics of it all. An empire without wheels, metal tools, or even a written language managed to coordinate agriculture, taxes, religion, and war over a landscape that looks like the set of a survival show. And tonight you're right in the middle of it, barefoot, altitude, dizzy, and trailing the ghost footsteps of a messenger who may have carried news that changed the fate of a nation. You shoulder your imaginary pack and keep walking. The trail narrows slightly, hugging the mountainside. One misstep, and you'd become a very scenic, cautionary tale. But the chasquis, they barely looked down. Trained from childhood, they ran these stone ribbons like their feet were stitched to the earth. You step carefully because you're not a chasquis, and also because you like your ankles. What strikes you most as you move deeper into the Andes is just how smooth and deliberate the road beneath you feels. No wandering curves, no bumpy shortcuts. These were designed for directness, like someone drew a line on a map and said, build that regardless of the giant mountain in the way. And that's exactly what they did. The Inca Empire was a world without wheels. That's worth repeating. No wagons, no carts, no horses, dragging anything with spoked inventions. So you might be wondering why. Build roads. Most ancient societies developed road systems because of wagons, but not the Incas. Their roads weren't for pulling, they were for running. Literally. And that brings us to the heart of their genius. The terrain of Peru and its neighboring lands is, well, not forgiving. You've got razor-backed ridges, tropical jungles, and deserts that could cook your toes right through your shoes. But the Inca looked at all of that and said, perfect, let's build a postal system here. The result, over 24,000 miles of road. You begin to notice small grooves in the stone-worn trails where countless feet padded along over centuries. Some sections even have built-in steps carved directly into the rock to help runners maintain speed on steep descents. The Romans may have paved the way for chariots, but the Incas made highways for human feet. And here's where it gets spicy. Some of those roads, they're suspended. Yep. Suspension bridges centuries before they became an engineering fad in the West. Made of woven grasses, yes, actual grass, they swung across yawning canyons like giant hammock walkways. Try picturing yourself dashing across one of those with a pouch full of imperial orders and a condor circling above, judging your form. You grip the mental handrails a little tighter. Now imagine this: the Inca engineers had no written schematics. Every road, every bridge, every tambo was built based on oral instruction, mental maps, and good old-fashioned teamwork. Yet many of these roads outlasted earthquakes that flattened modern highways. Go figure. You cross a shallow stream via stepping stones, and your feet instinctively seek the flattest ones. The Inca runners didn't stop for a splash. They'd leap from stone to stone sandals, flicking water droplets like mountain mist. And unlike most ancient empires, the Incas didn't rely on beasts of burden. For transportation, llamas were pack animals, sure, but not exactly made for speed or obedience. A chasquis could outrun a llama any day of the week, and twice on festival days. At one point, you pass a retaining wall made from polygonal stones. Each one fits like a puzzle piece so snugly you couldn't slip a razor blade between them. No mortar, just centuries of earthquake resistance baked in. And here's the kicker: these walls were often built without draft animals or wheels. Just ropes, ramps, and a baffling amount of upper body strength. You stop for a breath next to a small carved niche in the cliffside. It might have held an idol or an offering, a way for travelers to give thanks or ask for protection. After all, these roads weren't just functional, they were spiritual. The Inca saw their entire world as alive, from the mountains to the stones beneath your feet. Running across them wasn't just a job, it was a sacred trust. So you keep walking past whispering cliffs and sun-warmed stone. The trail curves again, and suddenly you're overlooking a dizzying drop into a green valley below. That's where the runners went too, down, across, and up again. No shortcuts, just pure determination and maybe a few coca leaves for stamina. Speaking of which, coca. The runners chewed these leaves to fight fatigue and altitude sickness. It wasn't a recreational thing, it was survival. You can almost taste the bitterness on your tongue. Imagine your lungs widening just enough to take in one more breath of thin, high-altitude air. Your mind wanders to the sheer scale of it all. Thousands of miles. No cars, no telegraphs, just relay after relay of people who trained their bodies to defy gravity and time. When a message left the coast for the mountains, it moved like electricity, human lightning bolts, flashing from one runner to the next. And the messages, they were sometimes verbal, passed from mouth to ear with practiced precision. Imagine a sentence whispered again and again across 500 miles and still arriving intact. Of course, mistakes happened. But that's what the quipus was for. Those strings weren't just backups, they were verification, physical proof, tied and knotted that the words spoken had a tangible anchor. Historians still argue whether the quipus system could encode full language or if it was limited to numbers and patterns. Some believe there were quipuca mayocs, or official readers and creators of the quipus who could interpret the loops and colors with astounding accuracy. Others wonder whether we're missing an entire chapter of Incan literature written in thread and long since lost. As the sun dips low and turns the mountain gold, you begin to grasp the scale of what the Inca accomplished. No wheels, no iron, no writing, just people trails, and a belief that a message, no matter how small, deserved to fly across valleys and volcanoes to reach its home. Your foot strikes a smooth slab that hums with ancient wear, and as you rest for the night on a ledge overlooking a kingdom carved from clouds, you start to feel something strange, a sort of gravity, not the pull of the earth, but the pull of purpose, a whisper of footsteps long gone, the ghost of urgency. The road doesn't sleep after all, and neither do the messages still echoing along its stones. You wake to the sound of wind threading its way through narrow stone corridors, whistling like a flute lost in time. The trail glows faintly in the morning light, casting long shadows that ripple across the jagged ridgelines. You stretch, feeling the altitude like a quiet pressure in your chest, and step forward again, this time into the world of the chasquis themselves. Imagine this: you're a young Inca boy, maybe 8 or 9, already being tested for stamina. Not in some padded gym, mind you, but by running uphill through oxygen-starved mountain trails with a woven pouch across your chest. If you trip or cry, well, there's always farming.
But if you show promise, if you can sprint with purpose and never forget a message, then you're on your way to becoming one of the Empire's most important people. A chasquis. You were the Wi-Fi of the Andes, the Bluetooth of the sun god, the living, breathing fiber optic cable sprinting across stone highways. Not bad for someone with a water gourd and a pair of sandals made from llama hide. Each chasquis carried a quipus, those enigmatic knotted strings, and a pututu, a conch shell trumpet used to alert the next runner down the line. It wasn't enough to arrive. You had to be heard. So as you approached a tambo, you'd blow into the pututu with all the force your altitude-thinned lungs could muster. A deep, eerie note would echo through the mountain like a myth come to life. That was the signal incoming. And like clockwork, another runner would step from the shadows, ready to grab your message and vanish down the next stretch of trail. This was not a solo job. It was a relay. Each chasquis ran a leg of the journey, some short, some long, depending on terrain, and then handed off the baton, which in this case was a woven pouch of knots and memories. The handoff had to be seamless. No time for pleasantries, no rest. Just a flash of eye contact, a passing of knowledge, and a disappearance into the hills. Like ghosts with perfect cardio. You pass by another tambo now. This one is smaller than the last, a single room, a roof of grass and thatch and a bench carved right into the stone wall. It probably saw 1,000 runners and 1,000,000 footsteps. Maybe it smelled perpetually of sweat dust and the bitter tang of coca leaves. You sit briefly on the bench and imagine your routine wake. Eat a handful of dried maize, chew coca, tighten your sandals, wrap the quipus across your chest, blow the pututu, then run, fast, always fast. There was no room for delay. This empire was powered by the foot. Every message, every order, every fish destined for the emperor's table traveled by tendon and lung. So chasquis had to be fast, but also smart. They memorized terrain like living maps. They understood timing, knew how to avoid landslides, when to rest a joint, and when to push through the ache. It wasn't just about being strong. It was about being dependable. Some chasquis even carried oral messages memorized word for word. These weren't just kids reciting poetry. They were high-speed couriers of royal decrees, news from the battlefront, and urgent updates from far-flung provinces. One slip of the tongue, and the emperor might send more grain instead of send more warriors. And nobody wants to be that guy. So how did they remember it all? Training, repetition, and some say a form of song. Yes, there's a theory that chasquis turned their messages into rhythmic chants or melodies to make them easier to recall. A marching tune for empire management. You hum something under your breath just to see if it works. It does. As you continue walking, the trail opens into a narrow valley, and a gust of wind throws your poncho up like a flag. You imagine yourself mid-run, the wind rushing against your face, the pututu banging against your chest, your legs burning in time with your heartbeat. This was a sacred task. The chasquis didn't just run, they served the empire. They were honored, protected, and occasionally pampered when they weren't, sprinting up vertical cliffs. One fun, slightly absurd fact, some chasquis delivered ice. That's right, blocks of ice wrapped in animal skins, hauled down from mountaintop glaciers so the emperor could cool his drinks. You're basically hauling the ancient version of a popsicle through the desert. And you better move fast, or your delivery just becomes water. But it wasn't all glamour. The roll was grueling. Your muscles screamed, your lungs ached, and one wrong step could send you tumbling into a ravine. There were no medals, no adoring fans, just duty and the rhythmic slap of sandals against stone. And yet this system worked. For decades, maybe centuries it worked. Faster than horseback mail in medieval Europe. More accurate than some colonial courier services. The chasquis were the bloodstream of the empire, carrying not just orders, but life itself. You stop at a bend in the trail where a short stone pillar marks a junction. These were the GPS of the ancient world waypoints for runners with coded carvings that only trained eyes could understand. Some say the chasquis left subtle markings along the trail to signal trouble ahead, slide storms, or the occasional rival tribe with a very firm opinion on border control. Historians still debate the full extent of their training. Did they study under special masters? Were they chosen from noble families or commoners? Were there female chasquis? The records are vague. Spanish chroniclers described them, but with bias and a bad habit of not asking many questions before conquering. What we do know is, this to be a chasquis was to trust your body, like a compass, your memory like a scroll, and your breath like a drum beat. Run, relay, repeat. You didn't get your name carved into temples, but without you, those temples would have never been built. Now, as you continue along the trail, you find yourself picking up the pace, not quite running, but walking with purpose. Maybe it's the mountain air, or maybe deep down you're starting to feel like one of them. You slow your pace just a little, not because you're tired, okay, maybe a bit, but because you're approaching another tambo and something feels different. This one's a little grander. 2 stone chambers, a water basin, a narrow lookout window angled perfectly toward the approaching trail. You can picture it the next chasquis, waiting inside, eyes scanning the horizon, pututu already in hand, every muscle primed like a spring. And then just as you round a switchback, you hear it, a low distant honk. Not a goose, not a horn, a conch shell resonating across the valley. It's the signal of a chasquis coming in. You can almost feel the ripple of urgency. He's on his way. And you're here to witness a handoff. Inca runners didn't go the distance solo. The entire system was a relay, timed, coordinated, and built to keep the message moving with minimal delay. You step aside, imagining the scene as if it were unfolding in real time. One runner crests the hill, lungs on fire, calves hard as stone hair soaked in sweat. He blows the pututu again, even louder. From the tambo, the next chasqui emerges like a wraith already mid-stride. The pouch is passed in a blink, not a word exchanged, just the message. And then he's off, no break, no snack, no dramatic monologue. The relay system never truly stopped, day or night, rain or sun. Across deserts, through forests, even over snow-dusted mountain ridges, the chasqui ran. The Inca Empire had engineered a human internet, and the messages pulsed through it constantly. Think about that for a second. This was before electricity, before bicycles, before the notion of a post office. Yet if the Sapa Inca wanted to send an order to the edge of the empire, it could get there within days, not weeks. From the Pacific coast to the Amazon, the message sprinted by foot-changing runners, every few miles like a divine whisper carried on 1,000 breaths. Each chasqui's job was to cover his leg of the journey as quickly as humanly possible. These weren't long marathons. No runner was expected to dash for hours. Instead, the relay ensured they'd run short bursts, intense focused sprints, then rest, then wait for the next round. The key here was efficiency. The Incas knew that one tired runner meant a delayed message. So instead of burning one guy out, they created a system of tightly spaced tambos, like nerve endings, each ready to fire when needed. You pause again at a particularly beautiful overlook where the road appears to vanish into a cloud bank below. Somewhere beyond that mist is another tambo, another runner, another message, and your mind starts to wander. Imagine you're holding a quipu, running with it clutched tight in your hand. The cord is made of dyed wool, some strands thick, others fine, each with tiny knots at precise intervals. It's soft, but firm, like it's holding secrets. And it is. This one might contain census data from a village, or inventory of stored maize, or even a coded battle plan. The chasqui may not know the full meaning, but he knows the root, the urgency, and the weight of what he's carrying. But not all messages were quipus. Some runners carried spoken orders memorized with terrifying accuracy. And when those messages were passed from one runner to the next, they had to be recited exactly. Like a game of telephone, but where the punishment for getting it wrong wasn't laughter. It was war. To assist memory, some believe the chasqui practiced mnemonic chants, rhythmic phrases that locked information into muscle memory. Others suggest they simply trained harder than you train your phone's Face ID. Either way, the success rate was staggering. You keep moving. The road ahead snakes through a dry, windswept plain. Llamas graze in the distance, and you realize just how little help they were for this system. Cute, sure, reliable, yes. But fast? Not a chance. A llama couldn't sprint the way a chasqui could. And while llamas carried goods like wool salt or potatoes, when it came to urgent messages, you needed legs, lungs, and resolve not 4 hooves and an attitude problem. You reach another tambo. This one has a tiny alcove carved into the wall, probably for offerings. Chicha, leaves, maybe even a feather or two from a sacred bird. These weren't just pit stops. They were sacred spaces. Each leg of the journey carried a touch of the divine. You weren't just delivering a message, you were serving the state, serving the sun. And yet it's hard not to laugh at some of the more practical realities. Imagine being the chasqui who had to deliver lunch. Because yes, food was delivered this way, especially to the royal family. If the Sapa Inca wanted fresh shrimp in Cusco, boom. Runners were dispatched to the coast. Seafood was packed in cool mountain grasses and passed hand to hand like an ancient Uber Eats order. Historians still argue whether the timing was good enough to keep the shrimp cold. Some say yes. Some say maybe the emperor just didn't mind room temperature seafood.
Either way, the fact remains the relay system was fast enough to move perishables across wildly varied terrain. Your steps fall into rhythm now. You begin to understand the mental zone a chasquis might have entered. Each stride steady, each breath measured. The landscape rolls past like a moving scroll, villages, valleys, slopes, and stone. Everything calibrated, everything watched. The relay system worked because it never hesitated. Every tambo staffed, every runner trained, every path known by heart. And in that way the empire breathed, exhaling orders, inhaling reports. A living circuit of humans across stone. You look up at the sun and realize how much ground you've covered without even noticing. That's the trick of this journey. The Incas didn't just build roads, they built momentum. And you're caught in it now, drifting forward like a message that absolutely must arrive. As the trail dips into a gently sloping valley, you notice the terrain start to change. The air gets softer, warmer. The stone path transitions into a stretch of packed earth, and tufts of wiry grass sprout along the sides like sleepy eyebrows. For a moment, the world feels less like a high-speed highway and more like a memory. And fittingly, this section of the story brings us to one of the Inca Empire's most cryptic and debated inventions, the quipu. You feel its weight before you see it. Not heavy, more like symbolic weight. It's coiled in a pouch like a sleeping snake made of yarn. You pull it out and suddenly you're staring at a cascade of knotted cords, some thick, some thin, some dyed, in earthy reds and yellows. Others still bearing faint smells of smoke or sweat. The ends are knotted in ways that seem deliberate, too deliberate to be decorative. And they're not random. Nothing in the Inca world ever is. This right here is the Inca data drive. No screens, no scrolls, just wool and knots. The word quipu comes from the Quechua term for knot, and what you're holding may very well be the closest thing the empire had to writing. Historians have long debated what quipus actually encoded. Some claim it was numerical data census records, agricultural yields, tax obligations. That theory holds water. After all, the Incas ran a vast empire with no coinage and no written alphabet, so something had to track the math. And the knots, they follow a base 10 system. Logical, clean, manageable. But others believe the quipus went beyond numbers, that these strings were linguistic letters, words, maybe even narratives coded into tactile language. There's a fringe theory that one lost quipu tells the story of an Inca ghost who rides a condor into the underworld. Yes, really. Fringe but fabulous. Historians still argue whether this is imaginative folklore or suppressed evidence of a truly lost script. And here's the strange part. Out of the thousands of quipus that once existed, only a few hundred remain. Spanish conquistadors didn't exactly treat these as sacred artifacts. They saw them as primitive toys or worse, witchcraft. Many were burned, some were buried, others vanished with their makers. Which means if quipus really were a written language, the Inca Empire may have been a literary civilization whose books were literally unraveled. You run your fingers along the wool cords again. The knots are tied with precision overhand, figure 8, looped into clusters that feel like tiny constellations. Could this be a story, a warning, a poem? You'd need a quipuca mayak, a keeper of the knots, to read it. These experts trained for years, memorizing the meaning of each color knot type, spacing, and length. A green cord
might mean corn. A thick knot could mean 10,000. A single twist in a certain position might change everything, like adding punctuation to a paragraph that otherwise makes no sense. Some scholars have compared quipus to computer code, and they're not entirely wrong. Input, output, logic, consistency, it's all here. The Incas may not have had silicon chips, but they had an operating system, one you could roll up and carry in a bag. You tuck the quipu back into its pouch and keep walking. The trail veers toward a small cliffside alcove where legend has it messages were once hidden in carved niches for emergency couriers to find. You peer inside. No messages today, just dust and the faint echo of importance. In moments like this, it's easy to forget that the Inca were master organizers. No written alphabet, and yet they tracked labor, resource distribution, religious festivals, even birth records. The quipus were the glue, the silent accountant behind every decision. And chasquis, they were the glue's legs.
You pass an old tambo half collapsed, but still dignified, like a soldier standing at attention long after the war is over. Inside you imagine a scene, a quipuca mayok, crouched by a fire, humming softly as he ties another cord, adding data to a growing record. A runner watches silently, knowing that in moments those knots will rest against his chest as he dashes into the night. There's something beautiful about it, intimate even. You're not carrying paper or gold or scrolls, just memory. Woven memory. Knowledge you could trip over and still not break. It didn't matter if it rained or snowed, the quipu endured. And they weren't just used by bureaucrats. Local leaders had them. Temple priests, farmers, maybe even a few smugglers who used fake quipus to manipulate supply counts. Yes, historians suspect fraud existed in the Inca world too. Humanity consistent across all empires. You glance up, and for a second the path seems to blur. The altitude's playing tricks, or maybe it's just the weight of forgotten knowledge pressing gently against your temples. Because here's the haunting truth. We may never know what most quipus said. Not unless someone deciphers the code, if it even is a code. And every step you take now is like wandering through a library where the books are locked, but the covers still whisper as you walk past. Still, the system worked. It worked so well that Spanish officials reportedly tried to use surviving quipus after the conquest to collect taxes. They didn't understand them, but they trusted them. That's how reliable they were. As you descend into a glade where the air smells of moss and sun-warmed stone, you can't help but feel a twinge of loss. Not just for the messages destroyed or misunderstood, but for the minds that tied them. The hands that knew exactly how to encode love, war, grain, and debt into cords and knots. You sit quietly on a boulder, the silence around you thick with ghosts. Somewhere in this very region, a chasquis once ran with a pouch full of mystery. You imagine him breathing hard legs, moving like river currents, a quipu bouncing against his chest like a heartbeat, with secrets. And maybe, just maybe, you start to feel like you're carrying one too. You rise from the moss-covered boulder and continue walking, the quipu still gently pulsing in your imagination like a forgotten melody. The path curls upward again, hugging the slope of a hill that overlooks a wide, dry plain. In the distance, you see the outline of another tambo, but this one's different. Bigger, sturdier, a bit, more dignified. You're about to enter the world of the Inca rest stops, and this one looks like it might serve more than just chasquis needing a breather. These weren't your average lean-to shelters or thatched shacks. The tambos of the Inca Empire were purpose-built roadside lodges spaced every few miles like ancient government-funded Airbnbs. Depending on their size and location, they ranged from simple huts to full-on compounds, complete with courtyards, food storage, and sometimes armed guards. You push open the imaginary stone door. Okay, it probably didn't have hinges, but go with it and step into cool shadow. Inside, the air is dry and a little earthy, like the inside of a clay pot. The floor is swept, the stone benches still smooth from centuries of sitting. There's a low shelf carved right into the wall, probably where supplies were kept dried: maize, salted meat, coca leaves, spare sandals, maybe even a rain poncho or two for the wetter legs of the journey. You sit on one of the benches and imagine the bustle: a chasquis arriving at full speed, a tambo keeper ladling water from a ceramic jar, a clay pot warming something over a tiny fire, chasquis stew perhaps. You smell it smoky, salty, strangely comforting. The tambos weren't just for mail runners. They served as multi-use facilities for everyone in the empire who had official business on the road. That included tax collectors, imperial inspectors, military messengers, and royal convoys. The larger tambos had quarters for high officials, storage for emergency grain, and sometimes ceremonial areas for making offerings before continuing on your way. There's a chance you could run into a priest, a general, and a chasquis all under the same roof, and each of them would pretend not to notice the other snoring. You step back outside, blinking in the sunlight, and imagine trying to manage an empire this sprawling without rest stops. You can't. The tambos were the gears that kept the relay machine running. Without them, the chasquis would have had nowhere to rest, nowhere to refuel, nowhere to report delays. Like, sorry, got held up by a landslide the size of a cathedral. And let's face it, everyone, even a divine messenger, needs a bathroom break. As you descend the path into the next valley, you notice the ruins of smaller tambos dotting the hillside like breadcrumbs. The spacing is suspiciously perfect, each one within a short run of the next. And that's no accident. Inca road planners used mathematical ratios to decide where tambos should be placed based on average running speed, altitude, terrain, and how much someone could carry before their feet gave out. Now imagine being a tambo keeper. Not quite a chasquis, not quite a bureaucrat, more like a hybrid of innkeeper, inventory manager, and occasionally emergency therapist. You'd maintain the space, prepare basic food, keep the water flowing, and make sure the next runner was awake when the pututu horn blasted from across the valley. Not exactly glamorous work, but essential, and probably a great excuse to gossip about imperial affairs without technically breaking any laws. There's evidence that the largest tambos were used for special royal expeditions, places where the emperor himself might stop during a tour of his empire. These tambos had better architecture, fancier masonry, and maybe even a welcome mat made of alpaca hair. You're not saying they were luxury resorts, but for the Inca elite, they were close enough. One curious tidbit: some tambos were located in downright inconvenient places on windy ridges halfway up a cliff or miles from water. Why historians still argue whether these placements were strategic military visibility, perhaps religious offering spots to sacred mountains, or just a result of poor real estate options after the good tambos were already claimed. You approach a particularly high tambo, now its stone walls half consumed by creeping vines. It sits right on the edge of a canyon with a view that could humble the proudest heart. This might have been a kolka, a type of tambo with added storage functions. You peek inside one of the side rooms and find it surprisingly cool even in the midday sun. The Incas knew how to use thermal mass. These storage tambos kept food supplies stable for months, sometimes years. Dried potatoes, salted meat, corn, flour, all stored in ventilated niches where even rats probably filed their complaints and moved out. And of course, the tambos weren't just a convenience, they were a form of control. By staffing each one with empire-approved personnel, the Sapa Inca could monitor who came and went. If a rogue runner arrived, or someone tried to smuggle false information through the network, the tambo staff would notice. Think of them as the empire's combination of rest stop, supply depot, and customs checkpoint all rolled into a tidy stone-walled package. You pause on the edge of the canyon and let your legs dangle. Far below, a river cuts through the rocks like a thread through fabric. You imagine a chasquis on the other side readying for the handoff. You blow your imaginary pututu. It sounds like a seashell sighing through time, and in your mind's eye, the next runner begins to sprint. You're part of something bigger now. You feel it. The tambos aren't just buildings. They're pulses in the body of the empire. Quiet hearts beating every few miles, keeping the blood moving. You might not get a statue. You might not be remembered by name. But you were one of the reasons the sun kept rising on the empire. As you stand and dust off your clothes, you notice a carving by the tambo entrance. Just a simple spiral. Could be art, could be code, or maybe it's a reminder, keep going. Because there's always another runner waiting, and the message doesn't carry itself. You leave the tambo behind and rejoin the trail, which snakes upward in a gentle arc. The morning's brightness softens as clouds roll in from the west, draping the mountains in gauzy gray. The wind shifts to cooler now with a briny undertone that tickles your curiosity. You're still high in the mountains, but the breeze carries a story from the sea. And not just any story. This one involves something cold, slippery, and extremely perishable fish. Yes, fish. Delivered over mountains. To the emperor. You blink at the idea. But it's real. The Sapa Inca, living high in the capital of Cusco, had a taste for seafood. And when the emperor wants seafood, you don't argue even if the Pacific Ocean is a couple 100 miles away, and there are a few minor obstacles in between, like the entire Andes mountain range. But hey, that's what the chasquis network was for. You step over a low patch of moss and imagine the first runner in this culinary expedition, sprinting barefoot across the coastal sands. He's holding a bundle tightly wrapped in cool river reeds, tied with alpaca cord and packed with crushed ice or snow from a nearby glacier. Inside shrimp mussels or some elegant little sea creature pulled from the shallows just hours ago. It's not exactly DoorDash, but it's close. And here's the astonishing part, it worked. The fish arrived fresh. Not frozen, not fermented, not pickled, fresh. It took a chain of runners moving at breakneck pace, through valleys and up sheer cliffs, passing off the bundle like a sacred torch. Each handoff timed perfectly. Each tambo stocked with emergency ice if needed. And all of this just so the emperor could have ceviche with his corn. You try to picture the logistics. Fish doesn't exactly enjoy being jogged across a continent. But the Incas were masters of timing. They didn't rely on luck. They designed their relay system with enough redundancy
that if one runner twisted an ankle, another was already waiting. There are even stories, though unconfirmed, of messengers running at night by starlight, the glow of the moon, their only guide, just to keep a fish from going bad. Historians still argue whether this kind of delivery was reserved solely for religious festivals or imperial indulgence. Some claim the seafood was part of elaborate rituals symbolic of the empire's dominion from sea to summit. Others think the Sapa Inca just had a discerning palate and an empire-wide grocery list, and fish weren't the only exotic items moving inland. Parrots from the Amazon salt, from distant flats, dyes from rare plants, all were delivered through the same system. Imagine carrying a live parrot through the cloud forests while dodging jaguars and trying not to get pooped on. Not glamorous, but essential. You crest a ridge, and suddenly the wind hits you full in the face, wet, salty, undeniable. That's the ocean you're smelling hundreds of miles away. But its influence stretches all the way here, because somewhere down there, a runner is scooping up a bundle of oysters, tying it with care, and starting the climb. You're just one leg of the route, one link in the chain, but without your part, the whole thing breaks. The road here gets rougher, steeper, scattered with stones that roll underfoot. Not ideal for sandals, but the chasquis trained for this. Their legs like coiled springs, their eyes scanning for the fastest footing, their minds calibrated for endurance. You wonder if they practiced on tougher trails just to make the real ones feel easier. You stop to catch your breath at a natural lookout point. Below you, terraced hillsides patched with green and gold llamas dotting the slopes like fuzzy punctuation marks. Beyond that, far off, is a haze that might be the edge of the desert, or the coast, or both. Somewhere in that haze, a fisherman guts a catch and mutters something about chasquis being faster than seagulls. Another quirky fact for your travel log: some runners reportedly used hollowed-out gourds to carry delicate or smelly items. One account even suggests a chasquis sprinted several miles with a live crab tied into a tiny basket, claws tapping impatiently at the weave. Is that story confirmed? Not really. But it's too fun not to believe. As you descend into the next valley, you pass a small tambo nestled among eucalyptus trees, not native but planted later. The stones are weathered, but the layout is unmistakable. A central room, a food alcove, a water jar, still intact. You imagine the tambo keeper here sorting through a pile of deliveries, grains, dried meat, medicinal herbs, and on very special days, the royal fish. It's quiet now, only bird song and wind. But back then, this was a busy place. Feet slapping the stone, breathless greetings, hands reaching out not for handshakes, but for handoffs. The message was everything. The mission sacred. And just as you're about to leave, you see something scratched into a stone by the entrance, faint but clear. It looks like a fish. Not elaborate, just a few curved lines etched with a sharp tool. Could it have been a tally, a record, a joke? Historians still argue about markings like these. Were they graffiti instructions? Warnings? You'll never know, but you smile anyway. Someone stood here long ago holding something freshly pulled from the sea and decided to leave a mark. You keep walking, the sea breeze still lingering on your skin. The emperor never knew your name, but he tasted your effort. You leave the fish-scratched tambo behind and begin the ascent toward the cloud line, your feet pressing into steps carved directly into the mountain. The air is thinner here, and every breath feels like sipping through a straw. But the Inca runners didn't slow down.
And neither do you, at least not yet. Because the Sapa Inca, the divine ruler of this vast empire, doesn't wait. In this next stretch of road, this is the high-speed lane. You're now walking on one of the royal routes, Capac Nyan, the Great Highway. It was maintained with extra care, built wider, straighter, and flatter, well flatterish than the rest of the network. This is the road where the most important messages ran. And by important, we mean stuff like royal decrees, military updates, agricultural projections, and of course VIP fish orders. The Sapa Inca didn't write emails, he didn't take phone calls, he didn't send faxes, he sent runners, and he sent a lot of them. Sometimes if the message was truly urgent, multiple chasquis would be dispatched along different routes, ensuring that at least one would make it through, no matter the obstacle. Landslide in the mountains? No problem, there's a second runner circling around the jungle. Bridge collapsed. Third runner already took the desert pass. Inca logistics made modern courier systems look like toddlers with cardboard boxes. And if a chasqui was late, that wasn't just inconvenient. It could be interpreted as a breach of trust, not because the Sapa Inca was cruel, but because the stakes were always high. In an empire this vast, a delayed message could mean a failed harvest, a misaligned ritual, or a border that fell into rebellion. So the runners didn't just sprint, they carried the pulse of the empire in their sandals. The emperor, meanwhile, sat at the heart of it all, Cusco, the navel of the world, a city so perfectly planned that its streets radiated like veins from a central plaza. From there, messages flowed outward and reports flowed inward like breath. You imagine the inner sanctum of the palace, golden walls, bright textiles, and quipus stretched across a carved stone table. Advisors murmur, priests bless the chords, a runner kneels. He's briefed, fitted with the message, offered a drink of chicha, and then he's off. Not walking, not jogging, flying. And here's something even wilder. Sometimes entire verbal messages were encoded into chants or rhymes, and each chasqui had to memorize exactly how to repeat it before they were allowed to leave. Think of it like a game of musical telephone, where getting a word wrong could cost lives. These weren't just athletes, they were memory champions. The quipus helped too, especially for numerical data. Imagine having to run 50 miles with 947 bundles of maize from the valley of Anta bouncing around in your skull. A string of knots made that easier, but for messages of tone like war warnings or emotional declarations, that was all on the runner's lips. You pass a jagged ridge, now the path clinging to the slope like a thread sewn through rock. You stop for a moment and glance back at the way you came, a pale ribbon of road fading into the clouds. You feel the distance. The empire was built to be felt. This way walked, not just ruled. Even now the locals talk about the runners like they were more than men, heroes, spirits. Sometimes when the wind is just right, they say you can hear the echo of Pututus across the valleys, calling for a handoff that never came. The system was so efficient that Spanish conquerors marveled at it. Some even tried to use it during the early days of colonization, though predictably they struggled. You see, the whole thing wasn't just about infrastructure. It was about trust, coordination, a worldview in which every runner believed their task served not just the government but the cosmos. The emperor, after all, was more than a man. He was Intip Churin, the son of the sun. His words weren't just orders, they were cosmic instructions. When you ran for the Sapa Inca, you didn't just deliver news, You delivered divine will. You were an extension of the sun's light reaching out over valleys and volcanoes. Even the tambos reflected that power. The biggest ones were staffed by administrators who acted as a kind of local government. If a chasquis arrived with a message that needed local action, say a call for more laborers to build a temple, the tambo staff could start organizing immediately. The message didn't just get passed, it got implemented. You turn a corner, and there not far ahead is another tambo, larger than most, decorated with symbols you don't quite recognize, serpents perhaps, or stylized mountains. A site of power, you think. Maybe a place where decisions were made, not just passed along. You step inside and feel it, the hush. Not silence exactly, but that deep quiet of responsibility. The sense that important words once echoed here, that choices were made. You sit on the stone bench and run your hands along the carved surface. It's smooth, worn down by generations of messengers, advisors, and administrators who all knew that one thing mattered above all else: what the emperor wanted, the emperor got. And now you understand the deeper truth of the Inca postal system. It wasn't just about moving objects or information. It was about connection, control, and the heartbeat of an empire that dared to exist where few could survive. You close your eyes. Somewhere behind you, a runner has passed off a message. Somewhere ahead, another waits. You are the link. You are the road. And the emperor is watching the sun. You leave the tambo with a steady pace and a quiet mind, the stone steps crunching under your feet like soft percussion. But you feel it now, the tension in your shoulders, the hair rising on the back of your neck. Not all runners made it, and not all trails were safe. Because let's be real, you're crossing mountains. And the Andes aren't exactly a treadmill. They're a wall of cliffs, crags, and drop-offs, all stitched together by trails that barely qualify as ledges. One wrong step and you don't get a second chance. Now imagine running these routes at full speed with no headlamp, no trail markers, and occasionally a bundle of fresh seafood strapped to your back. Sounds dramatic, it was. Welcome to the most dangerous postal route in history. As you climb higher, the trail narrows until it becomes just a few feet wide. To your left, rock wall. To your right, a sheer drop into a canyon so deep it looks like the sky turned upside down. You move carefully, but the chasquis, they sprinted across this. Why? Because stopping was more dangerous. Loose rocks, sudden winds, even animal attacks. You were better off moving quickly and trusting your feet. This wasn't a system built on comfort. It was built on momentum. You keep going, scanning the rock face for places where a runner might have caught a breath or stashed an offering for protection. A feather here, a carved stone there. But nature wasn't the only risk. The roads were usually safe. Inca law made it a serious offense to interfere with a messenger, but banditry did exist, especially at the empire's edges, where the control wasn't as tight. And even if human threats were rare, the wildlife wasn't exactly passive. There were condors overhead with wingspans wider than your bedroom. There were mountain cats, pumas with silent paws and very loud intentions. And of course there were llamas. Now llamas don't sound threatening. They're shaggy, they hum when they're annoyed, and their general vibe is hairy cloud with legs. But get between a mother llama and her young, and you'll be spat on in 5 languages. Worse wild llamas sometimes blocked narrow passes, and if they decided to lounge in your path, you weren't exactly going to shove them off a cliff. So yes, sometimes even messengers had to wait for
stubborn livestock to finish their nap. One curious story from the fringes of Empire mentions a chasquis being chased by a startled herd of vicuñas, a wild relative of the llama. The poor guy dropped his quipu, scaled a boulder, and reportedly yelled for help for 2 straight hours. Was the message lost? No. A second chasquis rerouted picked up the slack and delivered the same data. The system never stopped even when its runners got temporarily chased up a rock by fluffy mammals. But then there were the real disasters. Earthquakes, landslides, flash floods. You pass a section of the road that looks like it once vanished entirely. Just gone. Crumbled into the abyss. And yet just around the next bend, a makeshift bypass. Stones repositioned. Trail carved anew. The runners adjusted, they always did. You duck beneath an overhanging ledge where soot still lingers on the sealing evidence of a fire long ago. Probably a place where a chasquis camped overnight when the storm made running impossible. Or maybe he hid here, because sometimes the messages themselves were dangerous. Not all news was welcome. A chasquis might carry word of an approaching rebellion, a failed harvest, a general who'd betrayed the emperor. If the wrong ears caught wind of the news before it reached its intended recipient, well, a runner might disappear. Historians still debate whether any runners were ever deliberately silenced. The records are thin, but local oral traditions hint at it. There's even a tale of a chasquis who supposedly carried a message warning of a mutiny and vanished halfway through the relay. His last tambo reported he looked nervous, but no body was ever found. Did he run? Was he caught? Did the cliff take him? The mystery remains. Still, for every runner lost, there were a dozen more waiting. That's how robust the system was. Every risk was anticipated. Every trail had backup plans. Even if an entire leg of the route became impassable, messages could be rerouted within hours. No single runner was more important than the relay. You step onto a stretch of path rebuilt in more recent centuries. The stones are newer, but the route is the same, and it hits you this system lasted. Not just in memory, but in physical infrastructure. Some of the same trails used by chasquis are now used by modern hikers, herders, and school children. The roads endured because they were built with foresight, with care, and maybe with just a little bit of fear. You reach a plateau and finally exhale. The view spreads out beneath you like a myth. Unrolled valleys, peaks, clouds, and the faint sound of rushing water. You rest, just for a moment. And as you do, you imagine the runners who passed this way breathing hard, bruised, and battered, but determined. Because no matter what danger lay ahead, they kept going. They didn't run for glory. They didn't run for money. They ran because they had to. And so do you. You stretch your legs as the path flattens again, grateful to leave the death-defying cliffs behind for now. But the next stretch of road holds a different kind of challenge. Not danger, not exhaustion, something quieter, more subtle. It's the challenge of memory. Because while many chasquis carried quipus and some messages were passed verbally in rhymes or chants, a large portion of this ancient postal system relied on something even less tangible, the human mind. Specifically, the internal map each runner carried inside their head. You pick up your pace again, letting your feet fall into a familiar rhythm. It's a peaceful stretch. Golden grass sways gently at your sides, and birds trace lazy spirals in the sky. There's no sign, no carved arrow, no marker. But you keep walking. You know where the next tambo will be. You can feel the route. You're not guessing. You're remembering. That's exactly how it worked for the chasquis.
Most of them weren't handed maps. They didn't follow signposts. Their navigation wasn't written, it was lived. They learned the land the way you might learn a song. Repetition, rhythm, and trust in your own internal compass. From the start of their training, potential runners memorized routes by running them again and again until the pattern of the rocks, the curves of the slopes, even the exact number of steps between two turns became etched in muscle memory. They learned to recognize the scent of certain flowers that grew near water, the color of moss that signaled cooler temperatures, the particular echo of footsteps near a hollow ravine. And the distances weren't short. Some stretches spanned forests, high deserts, salt flats, or dizzying altitudes. But the chasquis didn't just know the way, they knew the timing. They could estimate almost to the minute how long it would take to reach the next tambo based on terrain, wind, and how heavy their breath felt. That kind of precision is hard to imagine in our age of GPS and turn-by-turn directions. But for the chasquis being, the map was part of the job. You pass a peculiar rock formation, now a narrow pillar with a notch at the top. Natural or carved, hard to tell. But if you were running full speed, your eye would catch it, your brain would file it. Turn here, simple, reliable. Forget ink, forget parchment, use stone instinct and memory. One particularly intriguing aspect of this memory system is how it overlapped with oral storytelling. It wasn't just the geography they memorized, it was the narrative of the route. One section of trail might be associated with a story about a famous battle, another with a love tale or a folk myth. These stories weren't just cultural window dressing, they were mnemonics, memory hooks, used to organize information. If a stretch of trail was haunted by legend, you were much less likely to forget where it began or ended. Historians still debate whether this blending of story and structure was deliberate policy or a natural evolution of the human brain doing its best to keep track of thousands of miles of road. Either way, it worked. Empires rose and fell on slower communication systems, but the Inca thrived with nothing but quipus lungs and memory. You slow your pace at the crest of a gentle hill. Below, nestled in a dip in the land, is the next tambo. It's small, likely one of the unmanned ones, a kind of self-service station. Just a roof, a water basin, and a platform to sit and rest. But it's in the right place, exactly where you expected it. The chasquis would have known, too. You step inside the tambo and find something unusual scratched into the wall again. Not a fish this time. This one looks like a sunburst. Just a circle with short lines radiating out from it. Maybe a doodle. Maybe a marker. Maybe a personal reminder that this stretch of the trail aligned with something sacred. Because for the Inca, even memory had a spiritual component. The mountains themselves, apus, were sacred beings. The rivers had names and personalities. The sun, moon, stars, all part of a living world. So to memorize a trail wasn't just a practical act, it was a relationship. You learned the curves of the trail, the way you'd learn the wrinkles on an elder's face, not just for the sake of efficiency, but for reverence. You sit on the stone bench and close your eyes. Could you run this whole route in the dark, guided only by what you feel, hear, and smell? The chasquis could. There are stories, again, unverifiable but persistent, of messengers running moonlit legs of the journey with their eyes closed, relying entirely on memory and foot feel. And there's something else, the idea that each runner passed not only the message, but a kind of psychic torch. When you ran a section of the road, you became that road for a moment. You embodied its twists, its breath, its tempo.
The next runner would receive not just your words, but your momentum. You rise again feeling oddly grounded. The route ahead is obscured by a bend, but you walk forward with confidence. The stones shift under your feet exactly where you expect them to. A breeze pushes from the left where the slope curves. A bird circles overhead. You smile. 'Cause now you understand what they knew: the map wasn't something outside of you. It was always inside you. The trail begins to rise again, curling like a ribbon around a jagged cliff face. The air is still heavy, with the kind of quiet that suggests a long history of footsteps, thousands of them passing this very spot. And this time you're not just thinking of runners carrying messages or numbers. You're thinking of the people they carried. Because here's something you might not expect. The Inca postal system didn't only move data. Sometimes it moved humans, that's right. The chasquis weren't just couriers of words or quipus. They were also part of a system designed to transport high-value people, ambassadors, messengers, priests, political prisoners, brides, and occasionally someone who might not want to be delivered at all. You slow your pace as the trail narrows to single file. If you were escorting someone important, you'd keep your eyes on the path, but your ears on your passenger. What were they thinking? What were they fearing? Were they on their way to honor or exile? One well-documented use of the relay system involved transporting ambassadors between far-flung provinces and the Inca capital of Cusco. These weren't just messengers. They were diplomats, often from newly conquered territories, escorted under heavy supervision to meet the Sapa Inca himself. They might bring symbolic gifts or precious items like woven cloths, rare feathers, or sacred herbs. Now imagine being one of those ambassadors jostling across stone trails, adjusting to the altitude, trying not to insult your imperial hosts, while silently wondering if the welcome at the other end might involve ritual sacrifice. Talk about a stressful commute. Other times the road became a wedding aisle. In some cases, royal brides were transported along these same relay lines, carefully escorted from one region to another. For the Inca elite, marriage wasn't always about love. It was about power alliances and the occasional consolidation of divine bloodlines. So imagine being 15, swaddled in your best alpaca tunic, eyes wide, bouncing gently in a woven sling as chasquis carried you up a mountain to marry someone you've never met. Historians still debate the logistics of how exactly these transports worked. Were the people carried in litters on llamas, on the backs of strong porters? There's no universal answer. But we know that tambos were equipped for overnight stays by more than just runners. Special quarters, reserved areas, and evidence of larger food stores suggest that these guest passengers were a known and frequent feature of the relay system. You reach a wide overlook now, and below you is a long, straight stretch of road, a rare sight in these twisting mountains. It was likely used for special transfers, when speed wasn't enough. Safety and prestige mattered too. One theory suggests that when a noble or emissary was being transported, the chasquis slowed their pace, not for lack of skill, but out of respect, or possibly because their passenger refused to run. And fair enough. Not everyone's built to sprint uphill at 14,000 feet, with a ceremonial crown sliding sideways. There's also evidence that hostages were moved along these routes. After a rebellion or uprising, the empire sometimes relocated the sons or daughters of noble families from distant provinces to Cusco, not as prisoners exactly, but as guests of the emperor.
hostages with nice accommodations, if you will. The strategy was clear. Keep the children safe but close. Their loyalty guaranteed the compliance of their parents. You pass a spot where the trail opens into a small flat clearing flanked by boulders. You can easily imagine a temporary camp here. The night fires flickering. A nervous young ambassador warming his hands, surrounded by silent chasquis, sharpening their focus, if not their blades. But it wasn't all politics and posturing. There were also religious pilgrims, messengers carrying holy relics or priests en route to distant temples. Some tambos had shrines attached places to pray before continuing the journey.
Occasionally, a chasquis would even accompany a mummy, yes, a sacred preserved ancestor, wrapped in cloth and decked in ornaments, carried across provinces for ceremonial appearances. Not creepy, just complicated. You try to picture that procession, a pair of runners, one holding the cords and the other holding great-grandfather preserved and smiling in the mountain light. It's strange to think of a postal system moving something so fragile, so personal. But that's the magic of the Inca roads. They weren't just arteries of empire, they were lifelines of belief, identity, and story. You descend into another narrow canyon now. The rock walls on either side rise high, casting long shadows across the path. It's easy to see how this place might feel like a tunnel between lives. One runner passes a message, another carries a soul. The same stone holds both stories, and if you stop here, really stop, you can almost hear them. A murmur of whispered prayers, the jangle of ceremonial jewelry, the quiet, constant breath of those who didn't run but were run for. You keep walking, not because someone told you to. The trail winds along the edge of a deep ravine, now where the sound of distant water echoes upward like a whispered reminder of how far you've come. The stones beneath your feet feel warmer here, sun-baked and smooth. And for a brief moment, you wonder how many different languages have echoed off these canyon walls. Because here's the thing, the Inca Empire, as unified and efficient as it seemed, wasn't a monolithic culture with a single tongue. In fact, it was a mosaic, dozens of ethnic groups, each with their own dialects, customs, and ways of expressing the world around them. So you might be asking yourself, in a realm so vast and so linguistically diverse, how did the messages actually get through? It's a fair question. The Inca Empire spanned over 2,500 miles longer than the distance from New York to Los Angeles, and within it lived people who spoke Quechua, Aymara, Puquina, Mochica, and a host of now lost regional languages. That's like trying to run a postal system from Spain to Turkey using hand-delivered memos, and each town speaks a different tongue, often with no written reference to fall back on. But the Incas, of course, had a plan. Step 1, enforce Quechua, their official language, as the lingua franca of the empire. It was promoted in schools, temples, and administrative centers, ensuring that at least government officials and messengers could understand one another. This was smart. But language doesn't spread overnight. Which brings us to step 2, contextual communication. The chasquis, though often fluent in Quechua, weren't expected to be fluent in every local dialect they encountered. Instead, they used memorized phrasing, repeated rhythms, and the all-important quipus. And those strings, they didn't need translation. A knotted record of 60 goats or a request for 300 bushels of maize is pretty universal when you know what you're looking at. But communication still had its complexities. Imagine a chasqui arriving in a village where no one spoke Quechua, and he's holding a quipu that says this village owes 2,000 baskets of dried potatoes. He blows his pututu hands over the bundle, and all he gets are blank stares. Now, what this is where the local administrators called curacas came in. These were regional leaders who acted as go-betweens. They were often bilingual, or at least trained to interpret the basic symbols and systems of empire. Think of them as ancient translators / mayors. If the chasqui couldn't explain it, the curaca would. And if the curaca couldn't explain it, the village's best guess had better be good, because no one wanted to mess up a tax delivery. You pass a crumbling stone outpost, now likely the remains of one such local checkpoint. The stones are simpler than those of the imperial tambos, but the layout is familiar. Central patio, clay oven, 2 narrow doorways. You imagine a curaca sitting at the threshold, quipu stretched across his lap, listening intently as the chasqui rattles off memorized lines in a language only half shared. And here's where it gets fascinating. In some regions, chasquis reportedly carried pictorial tokens or physical models, along with quipus, tiny clay representations of goods, symbolic weavings, or even painted boards to indicate ritual timing. These were like the visual aids of the ancient Andes. Didn't speak Quechua? No problem, just point to the clay llama. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was. Some believe it was limited to certain coastal or jungle regions where language barriers were most pronounced. Others think the use of visual supplements was a temporary solution during the early phases of empire expansion. Either way, the innovation is clear. If a word couldn't get through a symbol, could. You duck under a natural archway in the rock. Now the ceiling just high enough to let you pass without crouching. The acoustics here are strange. Your footsteps bounce back to you in a slow, delayed rhythm. It feels like the walls are listening. And perhaps they were, because oral communication wasn't just a necessity, it was an art. The chasqui were trained not only to run, but to remember, and their spoken messages had to be exact. That meant not only memorizing the content of a message, but adjusting tone, rhythm, and phrasing depending on the recipient's language and rank. A command from the emperor delivered to a general in Quechua might sound different than the same command delivered in Aymara to a village elder. Not in meaning, but in tone. This wasn't improvisation. It was ritualized communication where respect was conveyed not just by what you said, but how you said it. Get it wrong, and you risked offending someone important. Get it right, and the empire flowed just a little smoother. There's a theory among some modern linguists that the chasqui's memorization techniques may have included elements of early code switching, altering speech styles based on cultural expectations. It's something we see in multilingual societies even today. In that sense, the runners weren't just physical athletes, they were cultural chameleons, adapting on the fly to keep meaning alive across mountains. And yet with all these barriers, the Inca system worked. You cross a small bridge. Now nothing grand, just a set of flat stones laid over a shallow stream, but it feels symbolic. A transition from one way of knowing to another. You can almost hear the murmur of voices, layered in different tongues, a child learning Quechua from a temple teacher, an old farmer mumbling in a dialect now lost to history, a chasqui whispering a message under his breath to make sure he's got it word for word. One story, even if it leans toward legend, tells of a chasqui who reached a village and realized the people spoke a language entirely foreign to him.
Unable to convey the message directly, he mimed the shape of the message arms wide for gather hand to heart for urgency, fingers pointing to the sky for blessing. Did it work? Reportedly, yes. The village complied. Was it divine interpretation or just good guessing? No one knows, but it's yet another example of the system's unshakable adaptability. You arrive at another tambo, this one larger than expected, perched on the edge of a bluff with stone benches facing the setting sun. You sit. The sky turns amber. The wind tugs at your sleeves, and you realize language was never the obstacle the Incas feared. It was the bridge they mastered. Through rhythm, memory, gesture, quipu tone, and trust, they built a network of understanding so resilient it outlasted their empire. The chasquis didn't need to speak every language. They just needed to be understood. You rise from the stone bench as the sun dips below the jagged horizon, painting the clouds in shades of apricot and crimson. The trail ahead stretches into shadow, the kind of deep dusk where colors melt and depth plays tricks on the eyes. You tighten your cloak, not from cold, but in quiet anticipation. Because now, as the final rays disappear, you begin to understand the next layer of what made this relay system so remarkable it didn't stop. Rain, hail, sleet, snow burning, sun landslides, volcanic ash. Nothing short of the collapse of the trail itself could halt a chasquis. This was not a fair weather operation. It was a guaranteed delivery system designed to push forward under the most extreme conditions imaginable. You step carefully now, feeling a few fat drops of water hit your shoulder. A storm is whispering in the distance, low thunder rumbling like the belly of a sleeping god. You remember reading that some stretches of the Andean roads pass directly through active volcanic zones. And yes, runners use those paths too. Because they had to. Because the message mattered more than comfort or even safety. Imagine it. You're halfway across a highland plateau, and the clouds split open like a cracked drum. Rain pours down in sheets, turning stone steps slick and treacherous. But your time is calculated to the minute. If you slow down, the next runner misses his cue. The message is delayed. So you run anyway, eyes squinting through mist, sandals skimming across mud, your pouch tied tight under your poncho to protect the knotted message from soaking through. Weather was more than a nuisance. In places like the high Andes, it was brutal. Wind chills that bit straight through wool hail that battered the face like gravel, and storms that rolled in so fast even llamas took shelter. But the chasquis didn't stop. They couldn't. Some tambos were fortified for storms with extra blankets, firewood, and food, but the runners rarely rested. Not unless they were told to. Not unless they had to. And sometimes they didn't even wait for the storm to end. There's a recorded instance of a chasquis reaching a flooded river, crossing normally a gentle ford, and rather than turning back, he swam across, holding the quipu in his teeth to keep it dry. Did he almost drown? Probably. Did he deliver the message? Absolutely. You pass through a stretch of road that still bears the damage of an old rock slide. The stones have shifted slightly underfoot, and a few mossy chunks of granite lie beside the trail, too heavy to move, too ancient to forget. You step over them and realize that even natural disasters were calculated into the system. Reroutes were pre-planned. Extra runners stationed near dangerous zones. A single failed route didn't break the relay. It just bent it ever so slightly. And then there's the heat.
You enter a lower valley now where the air thickens and the trees grow denser. In parts of the empire, especially closer to the northern coast or deep into the eastern jungles, temperatures soared. There are tales of runners collapsing from heat stroke, only to be replaced within minutes by a standby chasquis who picked up the message mid-step and kept moving. You pass a grove of trees where the air smells sweet and heavy, almost tropical. The ground is dry here, but it crackles with memory. The lower altitudes presented their own set of dangers: snakes, biting insects, sudden downpours that washed away entire sections of trail. And yet runners adapted. They changed pace. They carried leaves to rub on bites. They even learned to recognize the warning calls of certain birds that signaled nearby predators. In one region of the empire, runners crossed active lava fields, yes, lava on cooled paths, carved into volcanic slopes. The routes were narrow and dangerous, but they were the shortest way between two vital outposts. And that mattered more than comfort. It's not hyperbole to say that some chasquis literally ran with fire at their heels. Historians still debate how much these extreme journeys occurred. Were they rare exceptions or routine? Were the most dangerous routes reserved only for the youngest, strongest runners, or were assignments rotated to prevent burnout and injury? No one can say for certain. But what we do know is that weather and terrain were never considered valid excuses. The Empire's communication system was expected to function regardless of what the sky or soil was doing. And sometimes the dangers weren't even natural. There were moments in the Empire's history when war broke out. Rebellions flared. Border skirmishes erupted. During these times, chasquis became not just couriers, but eyes and ears for the state. They'd report troop movements, resource shortages, or even coded information disguised within their memorized messages. Some stories suggest that in war zones, chasquis wore special tokens, small stone discs, or feathered bands to identify themselves as imperial couriers immune from harm. But whether this protected them or made them targets, no one can say for sure. The point remains they ran through war zones, alone, unarmed, sometimes with the fate of a village or a province hanging from their shoulders. You find yourself at a tambo again. This one's almost completely ruined. Just a circle of low walls, the stones scattered like teeth in a wide smile. But there's a mark on one, a groove that channels rainwater away from the doorway. Even here, even in collapse, the planning remains. And you realize now what made this system more than infrastructure. It was intention. The Inca roads, tambos, runners, quipus. All of it was built on the unshakable belief that the message must arrive. No matter the weather, no matter the terrain, no matter the cost. You sit briefly on the worn stone, letting the rain mist your face as the wind rises again. In this moment, you feel the heartbeat of every runner who's ever passed this way. Cold, wet, bruised, but never broken. Because in the Inca world, not delivering wasn't an option. You rise slowly from the moss-dampened stone, your knees creaking in quiet protest, and resume your journey along the trail. The storm has passed, but the air still hums with static. The stones underfoot glisten with rain, each one a tiny reflective mirror of the sky above. And as you move forward, a question begins to form. In your mind, a modern question, really. One that even the Incas might have found amusing if they could hear it echo across the Andes. How fast were they really? You've been walking for hours now, pacing yourself like a pilgrim or a curious ghost. But the chasquis weren't wanderers. They were sprinters, endurance athletes, human messengers. With a relay system so efficient, some scholars argue it may have rivaled, or in some cases, even outperformed early colonial and modern systems for sheer speed of delivery. You pause by a weathered milestone, just a carved stone jutting from the trail, smoothed at the edges by time and footsteps. It marks a section of the Capic Ñan, the Royal Road. This wasn't just any road. It was the Inca freeway where the fastest messages flew like birds. According to historical estimates, a chasquis could cover a stretch of 2.5 kilometers, about 1.5 miles, in under 15 minutes. Doesn't sound like much at first until you remember that they passed the message immediately to the next runner, who then did the same. Over and over, mile after mile, leg after leg, without stopping. This meant a message could travel up to 240 kilometers in a single day. That's nearly 150 miles, entirely on foot, over terrain that would make a seasoned hiker sweat. It's the ancient equivalent of same-day delivery in a landscape filled with cliffs, rivers, and the occasional volcanic detour. You run your hand along the stone milestone. It's smooth, warm. Somewhere along this stretch, a runner once sprinted past this exact spot, heart-pounding, legs pumping, holding a quipus tied tight against his chest. Maybe he was 20, maybe he was 50. Either way, he didn't stop to admire the view. He had time to beat. There's a famous anecdote told by Spanish chroniclers that the emperor in Cusco once requested fresh fish from the coast over 300 miles away. The fish reportedly arrived still fresh, possibly even alive. Now, historians still argue whether this was exaggerated symbolic or a misunderstanding. Some say the fish were carried in relays, each chasquis sprinting a short stretch while keeping the package wrapped in wet reeds and snow. Others say the fishtail was metaphorical, an ancient flex meant to show off the power of the system. Regardless, the point remains, the Inca relay was fast. Unreasonably fast considering its limitations. No wheels, no horses, no metal tools, just lungs, legs, and logistics. You begin walking again downhill now, and the road has changed. The stones here are wider, flatter, meant for speed. The incline is gentle but deliberate. This was a built path optimized for runners. Every step feels like part of a metronome, the rhythm of ancient communication. And let's not forget the engineering that supported that speed. Tambos were spaced perfectly, often every 6 to 9 kilometers, around 4 to 6 miles depending on terrain. That's just enough to allow for maximum sprinting efficiency without overexerting any one runner. It was a relay designed not for show, but for sustainability. You pass one such tambo now, still partially intact, its low walls curving like cupped hands beside the trail. You imagine a runner bursting in, blowing his pututu, handing off the message, and stepping aside panting. The next runner grabs the pouch, slings it across his chest, and vanishes before the first has even caught his breath. That's the handoff. That's the speed. And it wasn't just physical speed. The system also accounted for response speed. Chasquis didn't just bring news, they often waited for a reply. That meant standing by while a village leader or a priest or a military commander crafted a response, sometimes verbal, sometimes in knots. And then they ran it back. The two-way nature of the system kept the empire functioning like a nervous system. Reflexive, responsive, alive. There's something humbling in that. You're used to the idea that faster always means more advanced fiber optics, high-speed rail same-day shipping. But here, without combustion or circuitry, the Incas achieved a high-speed society purely through human coordination, precision without machinery, speed without shortcuts.
and yet they didn't sacrifice reliability for speed. Chasquis were trained to not panic. If a tambo was damaged, if a path was blocked, if the weather turned deadly, they adapted. The system absorbed the delay. Another route, another runner, a backup plan that kicked in not through AI or automated alerts, but through knowledge shared orally across generations. You descend into a dense eucalyptus grove. The air smells sharp and medicinal. The wind sighs through the trees like the cooling breath of 1,000 tired messengers.
And again, you wonder how many of them fell here. How many bones rest under the roots, unnamed but remembered in the rhythm of the road. You kneel briefly, not out of superstition but respect. These weren't faceless runners. They were instruments of connection. Their footsteps tied villages together. Their speed made unity possible. And here's a final detail, almost whimsical. In contrast, runners often carried little bells or feathered sashes, not just for ceremony, but for visibility. If the next chasquis didn't hear the pututu, he might hear the chime, or spot the flash of color across the path. It wasn't about beauty, it was about timing. So you keep walking faster now. Your own pace picks up unconsciously, as if the ancient rhythm has found its way into your bloodstream. Each step taps a silent metronome. Each breath falls into pattern. Because when the message matters, you don't walk. You run. The trail rises again, threading through rocky hills, where shrubs grow low and stubborn, and the horizon seems stitched shut by distant snow caps. You're moving briskly now, not quite running, but the road has taken hold of you. Each step feels deliberate, charged, and with it comes the quiet realization that you're not just retracing the path of the chasquis, you're walking into the heart of something deeper. Because the Inca postal system wasn't just about roads and runners, it was about power. You reach a flattened section of trail where the view stretches wide in all directions. A tambo once stood here, though only the foundation remains low, dark stones, half swallowed by grass. From this vantage point, you can see 3 valleys below each with a road threading into the mist like veins. It's no accident. This was a control point, a crossroads. From here, messages didn't just move, they were monitored. Because to understand the true genius of the Inca relay system, you have to stop thinking like a hiker. You have to think like a ruler. The Sapa Inca's power didn't just come from his divine title or his palace in Cusco. It came from his ability to know react and direct, and that meant information fast, accurate, and flowing constantly. The chasquis were his eyes, ears, and voice. They didn't just carry news, they enforced empire. You sit briefly on a carved rock half buried in lichen and imagine the network from above, roads like nerves, tambos as nodes, and the runners darting along the threads like electrical signals. This wasn't just a postal system. It was a mechanism of state control, the way the Sapa Inca projected his authority across thousands of miles. Every village, no matter how remote, knew that the road could deliver orders at any moment. A command to supply laborers, an announcement of an approaching royal inspection, a redistribution of food in the event of crop failure. And because those messages came fast, they demanded fast responses. There was no such thing as the message never got here. If it didn't, someone noticed. You keep walking, and the trail cuts between 2 massive stone outcrops. This was a choke point, a place where movement could be controlled. And that's exactly what the Empire did.
Alongside the chasquis, the state placed officials and record keepers in strategic tambos, watching who came and went, what messages were delivered, and what goods were transported. Historians believe that some tambos functioned like customs checkpoints, particularly along borders or trade routes. Runners weren't the only ones passing through. Porters carrying tribute caravans with building materials, even state-sanctioned llamas loaded with corn and textiles, all of them moved through the network under watchful eyes. And the messages, many were encrypted, not with ciphers, but with structure. A quipu wasn't just a record. It was a tool of accountability. If a village was taxed, the quipu held the proof. If a project was delayed, the knots told the story. Local leaders couldn't plead ignorance or manipulate numbers. The cord didn't lie. There's evidence that messaging discipline was strict. A chasqui who altered a message or delivered it late could face punishment. In some regions, tambo staff kept duplicate quipus or dictated oral messages into the hands of multiple runners. If one didn't arrive, another would. It wasn't paranoia. It was policy. You reach another tambo, this one larger than most. Its double-chamber design suggests it housed more than just supplies, possibly administrators. You picture them now seated by a fire, checking quipus by torchlight, comparing records, sealing the fate of a distant village with a few measured knots. And now you're starting to see it, aren't you? The relay wasn't just about speed. It was about structure. The Inca didn't rule through brute force alone. They ruled through coordination. And the roads made that possible. This system even extended to military logistics. During campaigns, runners didn't just deliver orders, they coordinated troop movement. A general in the field could request reinforcement supplies or intelligence and have his message reach Cusco within days. Responses came just as fast. Runners were dispatched with troop counts, enemy positions, even terrain maps, rendered in spoken form or knotted symbols. You pause at a switchback and spot a faint carving on the inside rock wall, a spiral. Not uncommon, but beside it a grid of short slashes, 4 rows of 10. A tally A warning A tribute, no one knows for sure. But the implication is clear. This place was watched. And let's not forget about migration control. The Inca practiced a policy called mitmakuna, strategic relocation of populations to maintain balance and order. If a group rebelled or overproduced or was needed elsewhere, runners delivered the command. People moved, no vote, no delay. But the system didn't operate on fear alone. It also provided protection. Communities hit by disaster could send runners to tambos for aid. News of a flood, a disease, or a famine could reach the capital within days. And the response coordinated food delivery, labor assistance, and medical rituals from trained priests or herbalists. You keep moving through a long, narrow corridor of stone shadowed by overhanging cliffs. It feels like a throat tight, echoing alive. You whisper just to hear your voice bounce back. Message received, you say, and the trail seems to nod, because at its core, the relay was about more than governance. It was about connection, not just top-down, but horizontal, neighbor to neighbor, temple to temple, quipu to quipu, a web of people tied together by roads runners and the constant pulse of information. You stop at the edge of a bluff and look back over the terrain you've crossed. River valleys, winding roads, crumbled tambos, and the ghosts of 1,000 footsteps. You can almost feel the empire breathing slow, steady, vast. The relay didn't just carry commands, it carried presence. The Sapa Inca might be hundreds of miles away, but his message was in your hand. his voice in your ear. And now as the wind picks up again and dusk bleeds toward night, you realize the empire didn't survive because it conquered. It survived because it communicated. Fast, wide, constant, and above all, controlled. The wind carries a sharper chill, now rustling through scrubby plants and rattling the edges of your cloak. The light is fading and the landscape seems to grow still, as if the very earth is listening. You descend a gentle slope where the stones underfoot become more scattered, less even. The trail here looks a little less traveled, a little less official. And maybe that's the point, because tonight you're stepping into the shadows of the system, the parts that weren't carved into stone but whispered behind closed tambos and passed from hand to hand under moonlight. Because the same network that made the empire efficient also made it vulnerable. With a little persuasion, a chasquis could carry not just truth, but lies. Yes, the Inca postal system wasn't immune to manipulation. In fact, it was occasionally used to deliver disinformation, hide inconvenient truths, or even perform the ancient equivalent of state propaganda. You cross a narrow stream where the stones form a subtle crossing point. This wasn't on the main trail, but it's worn just enough to suggest regular use. A side path, perhaps, one not marked on imperial quipus. The Incas may have ruled without a written language, but they understood secrecy and strategy, and sometimes that meant bending the message to serve the moment. You pause beneath a wind-bent tree, its trunk twisted like a question mark, and remember a story told by chroniclers after the Spanish conquest. During the reign of a powerful Inca ruler, a regional governor sent a chasquis to report a failed harvest. But when the runner reached the capital, he delivered a much rosier version. The crops had come in strong. The people were content. And tribute would be no issue. Why the lie? Possibly because the runner had been bribed. Possibly because the governor hoped to buy time before the truth emerged. Either way, the lie worked temporarily. By the time the empire dispatched an inspection team, the village had already begun rationing grain. The punishment was swift. The governor removed. The runner gone. Historians still debate whether this story was exaggerated by the Spanish, who had a habit of framing the Inca as overly rigid or cruel. But even if it's embellished, it points to a deeper truth. When messages carry power, they can be twisted. And it didn't stop with simple lies. In times of political tension, say, when a rival heir emerged or a border province began murmuring rebellion, the relay network sometimes became a weapon. A skilled chasquis could alter a verbal message by a single word and trigger confusion across an entire valley. A forged quipus could reroute a tax shipment. A whisper sent down the line, carefully curated and passed with just enough theatrical urgency, could spark fear. You pass a section of trail where the stones seem scattered, misaligned. Perhaps a detour was made here, or perhaps a message was never meant to arrive. There are stories, quiet ones, of chasquis who disappeared, not to weather or wild animals, but because their messages were too sensitive, too revealing. One account tells of a messenger sent to deliver evidence of corruption among priests at a major temple. He never reached his destination. The tambo where he last stayed burned down. Days later, officially, it was lightning. Unofficially, the message died with him. And then there's the matter of selective reporting. Not all lies are big and bold. Some are subtle omissions. If a region was falling behind on labor obligations,
but its leaders were close allies of the central court. Their reports might be massaged. A quipu might record delayed delivery due to road conditions rather than village revolt underway. Some scholars argue that this tendency toward manipulation helped contribute to the empire's collapse during the Spanish invasion. While the relay system remained fast, its honesty eroded. Reports of conquistador movements may have been delayed or distorted. Local leaders who feared punishment may have downplayed the threat. And so the empire moved quickly but with bad information. You pass a tambo half sunk into a hillside. Its outer walls are crumbling, but a section of the interior remains. Inside, carved into the back wall, is a spiral, another one. This one is surrounded by 4 dots. A symbol, a message, a warning. No one knows. The Incas didn't write history the way we do, but they left it in patterns and stories and in silences. The relay system also had its spies. Certain chasquis were selected not just for speed or stamina, but for their discretion. They carried verbal reports on suspected traitors. They watched for changes in tone at tambos. They might note if a runner hesitated too long or if a village seemed unusually silent. These weren't casual observations. They were reported upward quietly, folded into the rhythm of empire like an extra knot in a string. In some cases, chasquis were even tasked with deliberate misinformation, to provoke a rival, to test loyalties, or to draw a hidden enemy into the open. Imagine being told to deliver a message you knew was false, your orders clear your face, unreadable. The next runner receives it. The tambo staff nod. No one questions it. And somewhere far away, someone reacts exactly as planned. You reach a fork in the trail where a less traveled path veers into the forest. It's easy to miss, easy to mistake for erosion or animal track. But it's real. A ghost route. Some tambos had access to these hidden trails used by elite messengers or secret missions. No signs, no markings, just a curve in the stone and a whisper between branches. The fact that such trails existed tells you everything. Even in a system as ordered and public-facing as the Inca relay, the unseen was vital. Messages that couldn't be risked on the main road, orders that couldn't be overheard, lies, truths, and everything in between, all moving at speed. You turn back to the main road, your steps slower now, more cautious, because now you understand the runners weren't just mailmen, they were instruments. And sometimes the message they carried wasn't just a message. It was a move in a game no one else knew was being played. The forest thins as you continue, and soon you're walking under an open sky again, pale and gauzy with early dawn. You stretch your legs on the gentle incline stones, crunching underfoot, and your breath mists just slightly in the air. Ahead lies a wide bend in the road, one that opens into a long, flat plateau, perfect for speed. But this morning your attention isn't on the road itself. It's on the memory of the people who once prepared to run it. Because every chasqui, every lightning-fast messenger in the empire was once a child. And before they ran through mountains, they ran in fields. Before they memorized the paths of empire, they memorized the sounds of their village. And tonight, or rather this morning, you'll enter the training grounds of these extraordinary athletes. You pause near a low wall made of stacked stones, mostly buried now in grass. Perhaps this was once part of a yanayasha, a place where young boys were sent to train, not unlike military schools. These institutions existed across the empire, some small and local, others directly supported by Cusco. Their purpose: to prepare the next generation of couriers, builders, administrators, and yes, chasquis. You picture a young boy, maybe 10 years old, thin and serious-eyed. He's running laps around a dusty courtyard under the watchful gaze of an elder, his breath coming fast, his arms pumping. His sandals slap the earth in a rhythm that already mirrors the drumbeat of the roads. He'll one day race across, but speed is only the beginning. Because being a chasquis required more than fast feet. It required memory endurance and discipline. So their training included mental drills, memorizing oral stories, word for word, reciting numbers associated with colored strings, even practicing foreign dialects. In some schools, boys were taught how to handle quipus, not to tie new ones that was for the quipuca mayox, but to recognize patterns, interpret urgency, and carry them without damaging a single knot. You step past a row of stones that might once have marked a path for sprint practice. In higher altitude villages, boys were made to run uphill with weights on their backs, not out of cruelty, but to build the lung capacity and muscle strength they'd need at 12,000 feet above sea level. You try jogging a few steps just for fun. The altitude bites you immediately. Now imagine doing this daily as a child until it feels natural. Not everyone made it. The training was rigorous, and only those with the right combination of speed, memory, and stamina graduated to become true messengers. The rest found other roles, farmers, builders, local helpers. But for the few who succeeded, the honor was immense. To be a chasquis was to become part of the empire's living nervous system. In some regions, local families took great pride in producing runners. Chasquis lineages were real fathers, training sons, uncles, mentoring nephews. There's even evidence that certain tambos had family posts where generations of runners worked the same region, passing knowledge and shortcuts down like heirlooms. You reach a gentle rise now where 2 stone markers flank the path like sentinels. Perhaps they once marked the entrance to a regional training center. These were larger than the village schools, more organized, more official. Here boys not only trained physically, but also received instruction in state policy. After all, they weren't just delivering messages, they were sometimes delivering laws, tax commands, or religious decrees. They had to know what the messages meant, at least in broad strokes. They had to understand their cargo. You rest on one of the markers and imagine a lesson in session. A teacher unrolls a long quipus, its cords cascading like a waterfall of data. Each student leans forward, eyes narrowed, trying to follow the teacher's hand as it traces patterns in the knots. They recite colors, placements, quantities. They chant the names of villages and tambos, valleys, and peaks in perfect order, like a living GPS with no wires, just willpower. Beyond memory, chasquis were taught discretion. If they overheard private messages during handoffs, they were trained to forget them. If a tambo official asked about the previous runner's words, they were to offer nothing but respectful silence. And if they carried bad news, death, drought, disaster, they were taught how to say it without panic. Because even messages of sorrow must arrive with grace. You begin walking again, the trail winding through sunlit grass. A cluster of wild flowers dots the edge, red, gold, and pale lavender. Somewhere centuries ago, a group of young runners probably trained here, breathing hard, laughing between drills, unaware that they were preparing to hold an empire together. Some records suggest that girls, too, were occasionally trained as messengers, especially in more remote provinces. Though less common, they were praised for their speed and agility. The Spanish wrote of a few female couriers who delivered important ritual items. Historians debate how widespread this was. Some say it was a rare exception. Others think many roles for women were erased from the record like footprints on a wet path. You descend slightly where the road dips between two mounds. It's here you find what looks like a practice tambo, a small stone structure half standing its floor, swept clean by wind. You step inside and sit again, your back to the wall. This may have been a test site, a place where boys were timed on how quickly they could arrive, announce themselves with the pututu, and pass the message clearly to the next trainee. There's something heartening about this. So much of the Inca relay system seems built on awe and scale, the 1,000-mile roads, the soaring mountains, the gold-plated emperors. But here in this quiet place, it all begins with practice, with children falling, scraping knees and getting up again, with someone saying faster next time and a boy nodding determined. And over time, those boys grew up. They took their places along the trail. They blew their horns. They passed their quipus. And the empire moved mile by mile, knot by knot. You rise from the tambo brush, off the dust, and start walking again. The path ahead narrows. The road becomes real once more. The training is over. Now you run. You emerge from the narrowing trail into a clearing of silence. The wind has stilled. The stones beneath your feet are dry now, powdered with dust, and as you step carefully across the ancient road, you can almost feel the tension in the air, like the moment just before something ends. Because no matter how invincible the system once felt, no matter how many quipus were tied, how many footsteps pounded across mountaintops, it all came to a halt. Not suddenly, not with a crack of thunder, but with the quiet, creeping force of disruption. The kind of disruption that doesn't just stop a runner, but erases the reason to run. You're walking into the twilight of the Inca relay system. It begins with rumors. A ship has landed on the coast. Pale-skinned men in metal coats. Strange animals with hooves and long faces. Weapons that thunder. Gods who bleed. The chasquis hear the stories first passed in low voices across tambos. Messages from the coast arrive faster now, not because the runners are better trained, but because the panic is real. You sit at a crumbled tambo wall and picture a young runner arriving with such news, breathless, unsure whether he's reporting truth or hallucination. The tambos grow anxious. Some officials start sending runners 2 by 2, doubling the relay, making sure that somebody survives long enough to deliver the message. But the system, for all its perfection, was never built for chaos. It was built for harmony, for order, for the sun rising exactly where it's supposed to. And now the sun is behaving strangely. When the Spaniards begin to push inland, the relay system tries to function. Reports of battles, alliances, shifting loyalties, it all moves quickly. The chasquis carry it faithfully, as they always have. But they're not carrying ordinary messages anymore. Now they carry words that break the empire. The emperor is dead. The city has fallen. Do not resist. You rise and continue walking, but your pace slows. The Spanish conquerors, for all their confusion about Inca customs, quickly recognize the power of the road. They begin using the tambos the same way you would use a conquered palace, as a seat of stolen control. Some runners are kept on. They're told to deliver messages in the name of the crown now. But something's wrong. The rhythm is off. The authority is broken. What was once sacred is now confused. The Spanish chroniclers
wrote extensively about the chasquis, often with admiration. They marveled at their stamina, their speed, their memory. Some even used the system themselves. But they misunderstood its soul. They thought it was just about movement, but it was about meaning. And that meaning begins to unravel knot by knot. Many of the quipuca mayocs, the trained quipu keepers, are killed or go into hiding. Without them, the strings lose their voice. Without interpretation, the data becomes decoration. Spanish officials burned some quipus, claiming them to be instruments of idolatry. Others are taken to Europe as curiosities sealed behind glass, never read again. You pass a low cave near the trail. Inside, perhaps, once a set of quipus was hidden, a last attempt to preserve the memory of a people who recorded without writing. But time forgets. What hands cannot decode, the cave is empty now save for wind and regret. The roads themselves, so precisely constructed, so enduring, do not disappear. Many still exist today. Some are paved over, others swallowed by jungle. Some are hiked by tourists who have no idea they're walking on the veins of an ancient empire. But the runners, the breath, the blood, the voices, they fade. Historians still debate whether the system was fully extinguished within a decade or whether it limped along in rural areas for another generation. Some say the chasquis became rebels carrying coded messages against the new regime. Others believe they faded quietly into village life, their bodies remembered, but their purpose misunderstood. And what about the tambos? Many were repurposed, storehouses for colonial goods, army barracks, livestock shelters. The stone remained, but the spirit changed. And the quipus, those mysterious, beautiful strands of encoded memory, fell silent. You stop on a long, high ridge. Behind you is the empire at its height, roads humming messages, flying the emperor's voice, arriving on time. Ahead of you, the empty echo of what was lost. But here's something to hold on to. Not all was forgotten. In some Andean communities, fragments of the system survived. Oral traditions, songs, stories about runners who flew like birds. Families who kept old quipus tucked away in clay jars, unsure what they meant, but certain they mattered. And in recent decades, scholars have begun decoding those knots, slowly, carefully, with reverence. And so even as the relay system fell apart, its memory endured, not in steel archives or printed texts, but in the land, in the road, in footsteps. You kneel briefly and press your palm to the stone. It's warm, solid, still here. Because even when the messages stopped, the road remained. And maybe in some way it still waits. Not for another empire, but for a story. One that might yet be told, one runner at a time. The road bends gently eastward now, dropping in slow switchbacks toward a misty valley floor. Your legs feel heavy, but not from fatigue, it's the weight of reflection. You followed the pulse of an empire from its glorious pace to its haunted silence. But as the sun breaks through thin morning clouds and lights the path before you, another thought enters your mind. One that's less about history and more about mystery. Because while the chasquis and their roads are well documented and the tambos still rise in ruins across the Andes, there's one part of the system that continues to baffle even the most seasoned scholars. What exactly did the quipus say? You quicken your steps, drawn by the lingering enigma of those knotted cords. You've touched them in your imagination, already woolen strands of precise loops, hanging like the nervous system of a memory you don't quite understand. But here, in the final stretches of this trail, the question deepens. Because if those chords truly recorded more than just numbers, If they contained language, then entire books may have been lost to time. You round a bend and find another tambo smaller than most, but remarkably intact. Within its walls are the ghost impressions of what might once have been storage racks or quipu display poles. You step inside and imagine an elderly quipucamayok, a master of chords, sitting cross-legged, eyes narrowed hands, moving with impossible precision. He reads the knots not just for quantities, but for patterns, narratives, rhythms. Modern researchers believe that some quipus used binary-like structures, presence and absence of knots variations, in twist direction, color, and spacing to create layers of meaning. Sound familiar? It should. It's remarkably similar to code. And if that's true, then the Inca weren't just tying ropes, they were crafting one of the world's most unique information systems. Some quipus appear to have been tied specifically for ceremonial or historical purposes, not just for inventory. One set discovered in the early 2000s contains complex groupings that scholars think may correspond to genealogical records. Imagine a family tree written not in ink, but in wool. Each knot a birth, each twist a lineage. Entire lineages passed down not through scrolls, but through hands. You step out of the tambo and keep walking, the sun now warming your shoulders. In a way, the quipus are the most profound legacy of the chasquis. They're what made the entire relay system repeatable, scalable, trustworthy. You couldn't just pass along a story. You had to prove it. And the knots were the proof. But here's the deeper mystery. Why did the system of quipu reading seem to vanish so quickly? After the Spanish arrived, the runners could be replaced, the tambos repurposed, but the quipu knowledge, it dissolved. Within a few decades, no one could read them anymore. How some believe it was systematic, the Spanish, unable to control the information encoded in quipus, outlawed their use. They saw the chords as part of pagan ritual. Others think the knowledge was deliberately hidden by the last quipucameocs, passed into secret circles that eventually faded away. Maybe the final generation of readers simply died without students, their minds filled with data no one else could retrieve. You reach a tall stone marker and pause. It's carved with a spiral motif and something more, 3 circles in a line. It could be nothing, but it could also be a symbolic record like a quipu transferred to stone. Were there hybrid systems? Did runners once deliver oral stories anchored to carved symbols that mirrored the knots they carried? We may never know. What we do know is that decoding efforts have surged in recent decades. Linguists, mathematicians, anthropologists, many are now working together to unlock the silent language of the knots. One project even suggests that quipus may contain phonetic elements, small indicators of sounds or syllables. If proven true, that would reframe everything. Imagine finding a quipu that tells a myth, not a number, a battle, a joke, a love story. And why not? The Incas believed in continuity, not just of roads and food and labor, but of story. Their myths traveled the same trails as their taxes. The chasquis were not just couriers. They were vessels of memory, delivering not only facts, but meaning. You begin walking again slower now, as if hoping the earth might whisper a few more answers. The trail winds past a series of low terraces now overgrown. Between them lies a flat stone slab with grooves carved into it, some straight, some curved, some nearly worn away. It's tempting to see them as more than wear marks. Could they have been message boards? Places where traveling officials tied temporary quipus. public declarations, or coded alerts. Historians still argue about these quipu boards. Some claim they were early forms of public record. Others say they were simply surfaces for laying out chords during inspection. There's even a theory that color combinations in quipus represented entire phrases like visual idioms, and that certain communities could read them at a glance. But if that's true, then we're not just talking about a system of numbers, we're talking about a lost literature. A library unspooled into wool, its pages tied and bundled, passed from hand to hand across mountains, and we don't know how to read it anymore. Yet the chords survive. Bundles of them in museums, others quietly hidden in family homes. Some have been dated to the 1400s, others maybe even older, and each one, until decoded, is a sealed story waiting. You stop at the crest of a hill and look back. The trail stretches behind you in long golden threads. Tambos dot the route like punctuation marks in a sentence too complex to finish. But maybe you don't need to finish it. Maybe the story isn't meant to be closed. Not yet. Because every road still whispers, every knot still holds its breath, and maybe the next runner will know what to say. The sun is beginning its slow descent again, dipping toward the ridges with a quiet golden sigh. You've walked so far now, the time itself feels worn down, like the softened edges of the trail beneath your feet, and yet, even here at the farthest stretch of your journey, there's one final relay to run. Not with your legs, not with your lungs, but with your imagination. Because tonight, you are no longer the observer. You are the chasquis. You step out onto a flat ridgeline path. The sky opens before you in a vast bowl of color lavender, at the edges golden near the horizon, and deeper blue creeping in above. The wind is at your back. There's a weight against your chest, a small pouch knotted tight, warm from your body. It holds no metal, no scrolls, no parchment, just cord, wool, story. But that's enough. You take a breath, and then you run. It's not a sprint, not yet. You ease into it, letting the trail's rhythm pull you forward. Your sandals catch and release the earth in a pattern older than kings. The tambos are spaced ahead, like waypoints in memory. You know each one. You've studied the dips in the trail, the texture of the rock, the scent of the air as it changes between ecosystems. Each step is guided by muscle and memory, by training and trust. You run past a crumbling tambo, its roof long gone, but its foundation still holding its shape like a cup for the wind. You don't stop. Not because it isn't important, but because you're expected. The next runner is waiting. Timing is everything. Your thoughts begin to blur with motion. As your pace increases, your mind empties. This is the runner's trance, the moment where your legs think faster than your thoughts. Your arms swing. Your breath syncs with the road. And the message you carry becomes not something in your hand, but something in your bones. What's in the pouch? Perhaps it's a quipu coated with numbers from the northern provinces, amounts of maize wool copper stored neatly in knots and colors. Or maybe it's something more delicate, a message spoken to you in confidence by a priest or an ambassador, a warning, a request, a truth too fragile for written record. Whatever it is yours to carry. The landscape blurs past you, terraces carved into slopes like pages into a book, valleys yawning below birds, lifting into the air like scattered punctuation. You don't look down. Your eyes stay ahead, always ahead. There's a rise in the path now, a steep incline that
burns your calves and shortens your breath. But you've climbed it before. You know where to place your feet, which stone wobbles, where the sun blinds you for 2 seconds right at the peak. You know the path better than your own home, because this is your home. At the top, the wind greets you like an old friend. You smile, and then you descend faster now.
Your body moves with purpose. Your knees absorb the impact. The quipu bounces gently against your chest, its knots silent but full. You are the breath between 2 sentences, the spark between 2 decisions, the pause before action. The tambo is ahead, small square silhouette in the fading light. Someone waits just outside it. You see him before he sees you. His hand is already raised. He heard your pututu echoing across the valley earlier. The signal incoming. You don't slow. He steps into the path. You lock eyes. There is no speech. You reach across the space between you and past the pouch. His fingers curl around it before yours even let go. The exchange is instant, precise, like breath. And then he runs. Just like that, gone. You stand for a moment, hands empty, chest heaving, heart hammering against the ribs that protected the message all this way. The wind cools your face. The trail behind you glows faintly in the dying light, marked not by footprints, but by purpose. You did it. The message has moved forward. And now you exhale. You walk slowly into the tambo. There's a stone bench, a bowl of water. You wash your face. Someone has left food, dried maize, salted meat, coca leaves. You take a few bites, not because you're hungry, but because it's ritual, because it grounds you. You sit on the bench, and for the first time you rest. Outside, the night stretches across the Andes like a woolen blanket. The stars emerge one by one first, like sparks, then like drums. You hear the wind pass through the doorway. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't thank you. It just moves on. And so will you. Tomorrow you'll take another route, another message, another run. Because the message is not just something you deliver, it's who you are. And in that knowing there is peace. Now as you close your eyes and feel the trail drift away beneath your feet, let the rhythm of the road settle softly inside you. You're no longer running, you're floating. The tambos are distant dots of warmth behind your closed eyelids, flickering like little stars in a long-forgotten sky. You hear nothing but the hush of wind over stone, the quiet heartbeat of mountains, and your own breath slow and steady. You've traveled far tonight, across miles and centuries, across empires that rose and fell, across messages carried not by machines, but by memory, by muscle, by the trust of one human handing something precious to another. And in that silent exchange, something timeless was created. Feel your body sink now deeper into rest. The messages have been passed. The roads are behind you. There's nothing left to deliver tonight. No one to meet. No next tambo. Only stillness. Let the cold air fade. Let the stone become soft beneath you. Let the knots of thought in your mind slowly, gently unwind like a quipu, finally untied. And know this, the message has arrived. It is safe. You are home.